Alexis de Tocqueville grew up in a generation that was obsessed with poetry. Poetry was the mother science, the mother art. Poetry was the thing to which everyone oriented himself. And his generation wondered, what should its themes be? How to write it, according to what rules? And you'll notice that in his great masterpiece, Democracy in America, unlike all of his other books, Tocqueville wrote in a style that is shaped visibly by poetry. The laws of prosody and meter govern the shape of the sentences, the shape of the chapters, the mini-chapters. They govern finally the shape of his book as a whole, which follows a sonata form and in complicated ways. And the rhythmic qualities of his book, which, as I say, differs from everything else he wrote, the rhythmic qualities of his book allow him to generate a special emotion from time to time. And the rhythmic or poetic qualities allow him to strike certain sentences that have a very strange power that seem to leap up from the page. And everyone who reads Tocqueville notices this. Every couple of pages, you read a sentence which seems so remarkable for what it observes, but also for how it's said, that you hit the table and you say, that's amazing. Some of those sentences are aphoristic. He utters a truth, and others of them, which are the strangest of all, are prophetic. He seems to prophesize something that will happen hundreds of years ago. And of all the prophetic passages that have struck people's imagination for the now 180 years or so, almost 200 years since the book came out, I think the most striking, the most memorable, the one that has aroused perhaps the most commentary, appears on the last page of Volume 1. The book, Democracy in America, is 2 volumes. Volume 1 came out in 1835. The last page is the single most dramatic place in the entire work. And on that last page, he veers into a topic which he has not addressed at all, which he has not prepared you to pay attention to, a topic that catches you utterly by surprise. The entire book until then has been about America and the Americans. He hasn't talked very much about other countries. There are a few comparisons to England, but most other countries go unmentioned. And so it's about America and Americans, and suddenly he says on the last page, there are today on the earth 2 great peoples, 2, who, coming from different points, seem to be advancing toward the same goal. These are the Russians and the Anglo-Americans, that is to say, the English-speaking Americans. And then he goes on to compare these 2 peoples. And he says, the Americans are struggling with nature to build things, and the Russians are advancing with the sword. And he says, to attain his goal, the first, meaning the American, relies on personal interest or private interest and allows it to act without being directed. All the strength of his reason, and the second, the Russian, concentrates all the power in a single person. The first, the American, has for its principal mode of action liberty. The second, servitude. Their point of departure is different. Their ways are diverse. Nevertheless, each of these people seems to be called by a secret design of providence to hold in his hands one day the destiny of half the world. So it's a very strange passage. Now, why did he write this? And I'm going to address this question But allow me first to say that there's no place on earth more dramatic and no place in all the history that has taken place since Tocqueville wrote this book, more dramatic for asking this question than this University Hall in Kyiv in 2014. Kyiv, the capital of a revolutionary Ukraine that is under attack by Russians. Tocqueville wrote Democracy in America because he himself underwent the experience of a revolution. And this was the revolution of 1830 in Paris. Tocqueville was 25. He had just completed his law studies. So he was essentially a student. You will remember, the French Revolution broke out in 1789 and was very quickly a failure. It descended into the Reign of Terror. It conjured up a civil war within France. It led to the military dictatorship of Napoleon, who launched a mad war across the whole of Europe, causing a vast amount of death and destruction to many places, including his own country, a calamity. And at the end of this calamity in 1814, the royal family, the Bourbons, the family of Louis XVI, who had been guillotined, came back to power. Louis XVI's younger brother became king. He died, then his brother became king. So the Bourbon family was back in power. And they tried to be decent in some ways. They ruled with a charter, an aspect of constitutional rule. So they were more limited in their power than the Bourbon family had been previously, but still, it was the old monarchy. It was the old system. And nonetheless, ideas within society had advanced somewhat. There was a general appreciation that there ought to be at least freedom of the press in some limited degree. And in 1830, Louis XVI's younger brother, who was now king, Charles X, issued a decree limiting the freedom of the press. And immediately, crowds came out in the streets, above all the students. This became now the first revolution in history led by students. And with the students came many other people, and a revolution took place. It took 3 days to overthrow Charles X. The revolution was resolved by the National Assembly, who picked a new king, but who wasn't really a legitimate king, because a king can't properly be picked. He should just inherit his throne. So the new system was kind of a cross between monarchy and republicanism. Still, this was a real revolution, and this was Tocqueville's experience of it, and it had a strange quality, or a number of strange qualities. The first was that it was the first time in history when you could see the phenomena, this very strange phenomena of simultaneous revolutions breaking out in various places around the world, or in this case, in various places around Europe. Nothing like this had happened before, but now, with the revolution of 1830 in Paris, there's also a revolution in Belgium, and another revolution in Switzerland, and as some of you may know, a revolution in the November uprising in Poland. And all of these things took place within a few months, which is virtually simultaneous from the perspective of 1830. Why did they take place simultaneously? For mysterious reasons, but I'll note one reason that is not so mysterious. For the first time, you had a technology of mass instant or rapid communication, which consisted of two inventions: a printing press that could print daily newspapers cheaply, so that the masses of people could buy the daily newspaper, and the telegraph. So between the telegraph and the daily newspaper, the cheap daily newspaper, you could have an excitement that spread from one capital to others around the world. Now, let me explain that when you find yourself in a revolution of that sort, the emotion that presses upon you is very strange and very intense, because you're aware that you are participating in an event. This is the experience of Tocqueville's generation. You're aware that you're experiencing a vast event. You're aware that forces larger than you can imagine have come into play. You're aware or faintly aware that it has international connotations. So you get the impression that the destiny of mankind is in play. You get this impression very strongly. You get the impression that enormous changes are at hand. You certainly get the impression that enormous changes are at hand in regard to your own life, that your own life is going to be turned upside down. And so you find yourself riding as if upon an ocean wave of these events and impressions. Then you find yourself, or typically you find yourself in one other very difficult situation, which is you're in the middle of this revolution, you're taking part in it, or you're standing on the sidelines and observing it, and you're trying to make up your mind, and you discover that you're in an intense crisis with your own family, with your own background, that your mother and father think one thing, you think another thing, the family direction is this way, you want to go that way, or you wonder whether you want to go that way, and you have a personal crisis. And this is absolutely the rule. Now, of everybody who has gone through such an event and has undergone a personal crisis, I think that Alexis de Tocqueville was the person who, at age 25, went through all this, was the person who dealt with this crisis most creatively. His crisis was extreme, and that was because his own family were ancient French aristocrats, and the family was tied to the Bourbon monarchy that had just been overthrown. They were tied to the Bourbon monarchy by belief, by political belief. They were tied by custom. And they were tied by religious reasons. This was their interpretation of Catholicism. That was proper to be loyal to the legitimate king. And they were tied also because during the revolution of 1789, before Alexis's birth, Alexis was born in 1805. But during the revolution of 1789, his parents and the larger family were loyal to Louis XVI, who was guillotined. And then, during the Reign of Terror, Tocqueville's father and his mother were imprisoned. And other members of the family, the cousins, were guillotined. The family of Tocqueville's mother were guillotined, and Tocqueville's father and mother themselves were just waiting for themselves to be guillotined. Then Robespierre was overthrown. The Reign of Terror came to an end, and they exited the prison. Tocqueville's father was famous for having had his hair turn white, although he was a very young man. So Tocqueville now, young Tocqueville, Alexis de Tocqueville, in 1830, he looks at the overthrow of the Bourbon monarchy, and from the point of view of his own family, of course, he has to be horrified. And now he has, yet he himself is wondering. And now he has another problem, because he has just gotten his law degree, and he's ready to practice law as a magistrate. But in order to practice law, he must swear an oath to the new king. He cannot swear an oath. It would be a dreadful dishonor to his family to swear an oath to this usurper who's just overthrown the Bourbon monarchy. And at the same time, he has to worry, maybe this new revolution is going to bring a new reign of terror. No one knows. It didn't, but he had to worry about it. So he dealt with this problem by joining together with his best friend, Gustave de Beaumont, from another aristocratic family. And the two of them went to America for 9 months in 1831 and 2. And they went to America in order to ask two questions, or Tocqueville especially, two questions. One, if there's a democratic revolution, could it possibly be good? There was no experience of a good revolution in France. There had been bad revolutions. But could there be a good one? Had there been a good one in America? And the second question was, if you're going to make the transition from a hierarchical society to a democratic society, how do you do it? So he came and he asked these questions. Now he had two responses. The first, to his experience, the first was to come to America and feel that he had seen, that in America he had seen what he'd begun to see in France in 1830, in the Revolution. That he'd begun to see something that had the power of absolute destiny. That he knew for a certainty that all of history was moving from a hierarchical society to a democratic society. He knew this because he saw it, and also he looked back at 700 years of history, and he looked at the progression of the Middle Ages, and he found himself thinking that yes, he could see something so vast and so powerful that he was convinced that he saw the finger of God tracing a path across the stars. And this path was leading to democracy. By democracy, he meant something very specific. He calls it equality of conditions. And what it really means, it does not mean equality of wealth or material goods. It means equality of rank. A democracy is a society in which there is no special class of nobles, nor is there some special ethnic group, nor some special group of any sort who possess rights and privileges that other people do not possess. So a democracy is a society, thus, that has an equality of status. Now, in order to have an equality of status, the laws and customs have to create that situation, but the really telling thing, the factor that identifies for Tocqueville a society as democratic is psychological. A democratic society is one in which people feel that they have the same standing as everyone else. Whether or not they're as rich, they feel that they are the equal of the next person. He felt that he had seen such a society. Now, of course, he confined his travels pretty much to the northern part of America, and the United States at the time only went halfway across the continent, and he remained in the north. So we're talking about, if you can picture the United States as a rectangle, we're talking about one quadrant of it. So New England, the Middle Atlantic states, Ohio, places like that, where there wasn't slavery. And this was the part of America that he was talking about. So he felt that all of history was leading in the direction of such a society. And by all of history, he meant his own country too, France, and more broadly, Europe, with some implication of the rest of the world. So that was his first feeling, and he describes it as a religious experience. He says he experienced a religious terror, meaning he trembled at the thought of this. And he felt that if God had traced his finger across the sky, if that was the meaning of it, then to oppose this development toward democracy is to oppose God. So he'd already made a tremendous decision in regard to his own family. Now he wants to address his family. So he asks himself, it's an open debate that he has with himself. He asks himself, okay, we're going in the direction of democracy. Is it good or is it bad? It might be good or it might be bad. And he, for the next 800 pages, he debates this with himself. And it's a real debate because he goes through moods, and his mood is sometimes this way and sometimes more discouraged. In general, on balance, more often, he thinks, yes, it is good. And it's good because a real democratic society is one that develops the kind of people, the kind of citizens who are able to participate, who are able to populate a democratic society, are able to make it work, who have the sense of virtue and the willingness to participate, who are good citizens, who know what it is to be good citizens, who want to be good citizens and are. And a democratic society, according to him, has this kind of population because it itself, the society generates people like this. And it generates people like this above all first of all, because the kinds of institutions that it develops. And he goes through what are the institutions that lead to this. The first is there's political decentralization. And political decentralization means that people locally can participate in the government in some way. So the government is not designed to be top-down or from the center out. So there's a political decentralization. Then a whole series of other institutions. The most fantastic chapter in the book is on local self-government. He describes something called town meetings. A town meeting is something that takes place in a small town where the entire town will assemble now and then and have a meeting. So to discuss things, to make decisions, which is to say it is a direct democracy, not a representative democracy. Now this kind of direct democracy that he describes in an absolutely ecstatic chapter, almost with a utopian mood, if you've read some Proudhon or Bakunin, it can sound like the anarchists speaking about self-government, or it has some quality that the Machiavelli had, if you picture them. But Tocqueville's version, or the version that he describes, is superior to either of those kinds of direct democracies, because it is linked also to rule of law and linked also to representative democracy. So the American system, as he describes it, is able to incorporate direct democracy into representative democracy. He describes the jury system, in which the ordinary person participates in judicial decisions of guilt or innocence in trials. He describes yet another aspect of participation, which has nothing to do with the state and nothing to do with legal systems, which is voluntary associations. So people join together because they're in favor of some reform or other, or they're in favor of something. And instead of petitioning the government to administer this reform, they may go out and just do it themselves. Thus, if they want to build a building for some purpose, instead of asking the government to build it, they go out and build it themselves, form an association. He laughs at one of them, and it's interesting to see. He sees what is called a temperance movement, marching by in a mass march. A temperance movement is a movement that wants to ban alcoholism and wants to get people to stop drinking. And he reflects that in France, if there's a problem with too much drinking, people will petition the government, meaning the central government in Paris, to come close the bars. And they'll wait for the government to do it, or not. But in America, the people just go out and march in the streets, demanding it of their fellow citizens. They're not demanding it of the government, they're just demanding it as a social reform. And he found himself laughing. What a ridiculous movement, he thought. And then he had a second thought. He thought, no, actually it's very impressive, it's moving. Here was something, excessive drinking, that required a reform. And the people just took it into their own hands to create a reform movement, which is not the state, they just did it themselves. It's a movement from the bottom up instead of from the top down. So these are what he describes as voluntary associations. And then these kinds of institutions, the voluntary associations, the juries, the town meetings, all have the effect of, have a double or triple effect. They allow people to participate, but they also train people to participate. So by participating in these things, you learn how to participate. You learn how the government works. You are the government. Or you learn how social reforms are made. You are making them. And by participating in a jury, you learn what is the law? What is the meaning of the law? So that the nature of government is demystified. And these kinds of institutions have then an educational quality. He reflects that in some ways they lead to less efficient administration than the kind of government he knows in Europe, where in France there's a very efficient administrative system, and more efficient than what he sees in America, but it leaves the citizens in France stupid, not knowing how to do things themselves, and leaves them in a frame of mind that he describes as servile. They're waiting for somebody else to do it for them, whereas the participants in these kinds of institutions, in the America that he's describing, are themselves doing it, know how to do it, have become intelligent about doing it. So these kinds of institutions then create better people. Then he goes on. He sees a new spirit of business or commerce in America, where he sees people and he admires them, being rash in business and boldly going out and doing something really new. He marvels at how American shipping is beginning to conquer the world in a commercial sense. And why is it? Because they're so bold. And he finally realizes that there's a grandeur to this, which is a great leap for an aristocrat like himself, because aristocrats are not supposed to work, you know, and certainly not supposed to admire business. But he sees a grandeur in it. And he thinks that America, the democracy in America that he's seen, has invented a grandeur of a new kind. France had a grandeur, but it consisted of Napoleon's army, which wreaked nothing but destruction. And America has a grandeur which consists of businesses that, like Napoleon, are conquering the world, but doing it constructively. And so he admires that. He sees a new kind of family life that results from all of this. Because if you've eliminated the different conditions, if you've eliminated rank, then you find family lives in which it's no longer the case that the older brother has more prestige than the younger brother, because in the old system, the older brother is going to inherit the title, he's going to inherit the land, all the prestige is going to be his. So he's at one level, the younger brother is at another level, the father holds himself above distantly and is cold. Whereas in the democratic family that Tocqueville describes, everybody is sort of equal. The brothers are equal. They're going to share the inheritance, so one is not higher than the other. And the father becomes a friend to his sons. And he has some odd comments about women and how they're very virtuous because they don't leave the home. But so, you know, some aspects of his book are peculiar. But the notes on family life are very striking. And then finally, he turns to religion. And he notices something new in American democracy here too, which is that in France, the assumption had been all along that religion must be the enemy of progress and of democracy. But in America, he notices that the churches are the friend of progress and democracy. And then he notices that democracy is the friend of the church, that the churches prosper, whereas they wither in France. And he notices something else, that under democracy, a man begins to conceive of God more grandly, because the individual is no longer confined to his one little tiny place in life. Society is open to him, and if society is open to him, then he can conceive of a larger God. So he has a grander God, And by conceiving of God more grandly, he conceives of himself more grandly. It's a moving idea. Then again, as I say, he is arguing with himself. So he tallies up all the things that seem to him horrendous and dangerous. He sees that democracy might lead to a different kind of tyranny, the tyranny of the majority. He notes antidotes to this which be law and lawyers, but still a real danger of the tyranny of the majority, a kind of mob rule by the majority. He notices a tendency toward conformism of thought. He's horrified by this. He finds one person after another uttering the same opinions in America, horrible conformity. He notices a tendency toward cultural mediocrity. There's a leveling, and he worries about that. And he worries, finally, about something that he calls individualism, by which he means something bad. Maybe we would say, egoism, selfishness. And by individualism or selfishness, he means that under a democracy, where people no longer feel themselves to be part of some special class and are no longer given a particular role in life, they're likely, the individual is likely to begin to think only of himself and not to care about society and to withdraw from society and just look out only for himself. So these are all frightening. And then he sees a possible ultimate result of this, which is, if you are an individualist in this sense, and you've withdrawn from your sense of society, you're no longer going to be willing to sacrifice for society. And then he wonders, a democracy, would it be willing to fight? He observes that the United States, we're now in 1831, that the United States, following its War of Independence with Britain, has never been challenged. So there's no way to know whether a democracy would fight. And he begins to think about the possibilities. Now his imagination turns towards the race situation in America, the South, where there's African slavery. He's very intelligent about this, and he interprets the blacks and the whites. But he also cannot picture a solution to this problem. And he imagines that there will end up being a race war, or some kind of war will break out over slavery. And indeed, 30 years later, a war broke out over slavery, the American Civil War. But he's picturing this in the 1830s. He knows he feels that a war is going to break out over this. And then he imagines to himself that when a war like this breaks out, the United States will collapse. That the United States will not be able to summon the strength to fight, to preserve its own unity. And that no one is going to be able to summon the power to impose a solution to this terrible problem. And he sinks into gloom. So he's gone back and forth. And now he's at the end of volume 1, and his gloom deepens. And obviously, he runs his eye across the horizon of the entire world, and he pictures democracy. And he says, is democracy going to triumph? And then his eye runs in this direction, and he sees Russia. And he thinks, this is what's happening. That in the future there is going to be a gigantic conflict of the American principle of liberty and self-government and productivity, and what he describes as the Russian principle of the sword and one-man rule and servility. And the book is over. So he leaves you wondering, what's going to happen? He doesn't know what's going to happen. Now, as I say, on balance, you can see where his feelings are. He's wild with enthusiasm for the democracy that he's seen in America. But his dark moods sometimes overcome him, and he cannot quite decide. He's conducting this debate honestly with himself, but it's obvious that he's also conducting the debate for the benefit of his family and his social circle. He he wants to give the aristocrats, the champions of aristocracy or monarchism, every possible argument and rebut it if he can. And some of them he can't. And above all, he can't rebut this question of whether a democracy will be able to fight. Now, this passage about America and Russia is, as I say, I think, above all, a reflection of his own mood. It's his inner psychology. But it also does have a prophetic quality. And to see the prophetic quality, you do not have to move very far forward from the 1830s, because in 1848, another of these simultaneous revolutionary waves broke out, in Paris first and then all over Europe, and even in other parts of the world in some degree. And in Eastern Europe, or Central and Eastern Europe, you had the question of a Russian or a Tsarist intervention. And the whole question of whether America should have something to do with this arose then. And it was because in the American presidential elections are held every 4 years. So the 1848 revolution took place, and then it failed everywhere. So the next American revolution was American election was 1852. So the American presidential election of 1852, the revolutions of Europe in 1848 were debated and were an issue. And one of the figures, European revolutionary figures, was Louis Kossuth, who was the leader of the Hungarian Revolution of 1848. Kossuth was campaigning for the Democratic Party in the United States. And there were figures in the Democratic Party who were calling for the United States to send weapons to Kossuth in Hungary to fight a war against the Tsar. Arisen. Of course, that idea was mad, and nothing was done with it. But it was already there. One other event about 1848, which is that Tocqueville, of course, was observing the revolution of 1848, and in Paris, the revolution went well for a little while, and he took the occasion to issue a new edition of Democracy in America, in which he published a preface, which is difficult to find. Most editions of Democracy in America do not include the 1848 preface. The fantastic French edition, the best French edition, does not include it. But there's a paperback French edition that does include it. And I don't know what's available in Ukrainian. But the 1848 preface is very interesting. It's obvious that Tocqueville is now, it's as if he's clarified his relations with his family. You know, he's no longer upset about whether his father and mother would think, I don't know if they were still alive. Probably not. And he's his own man. He's more confident of himself, and he's very excited. And he wants to say, so the new revolution has come out. And it's as if he holds up his book and he says, I was right. Meaning, democracy is coming, it's inevitable, it is the finger of God, and it can be good. This is what I see when I look at Tocqueville in Kiev in 2014. As I say, it's impossible to find a more dramatic place to read Tocqueville than right here, or to talk about him. Because the revolution in Maidan, this revolution, which is your revolution, is absolutely a classic European revolution of the type that began really not in 1789, but in 1830. And the revolution in Maidan is a direct descendant of the 1830s in France, even in its style. And the 1830 revolution had many qualities, the students, but there was a little aftershock of it, which took place in 1832, a failed additional revolution, which is the revolution you can read about in Victor Hugo's novel, Les Miserables. And that revolution is the first time in history you see barricades going up in the streets of Paris. And this is before photographs, no photographs. You can see photographs of the barricades of 1848, but not of 1832. But there they are. And of course, the other day as I'm wandering around the square and I'm looking at the piles of tires and bricks, and I'm realizing this is it. This is the absolute classic statement. And it's not that the barricades are, from a military point of view, to put it that way, so effective. But they are a statement, they're expressive. And they're just one more indication of the classic nature of what has been happening here. I conclude with this one thought. You know, many statues of Lenin have come down, and I would suppose that there must be many pedestals that are now empty, or parks, plazas with a place for a statue that no longer has a statue. And I make a modest suggestion to you that one of those empty pedestals should be filled with a statue of Alexis de Tocqueville, because he speaks to the American situation, the American problem, and he speaks to your problem, and which is how to make the transition to a democratic society, and how to make sure that that the transition goes well, and how to make sure that the revolutionary result is a good result and not a bad result, given that either is possible. So, thank you. Yes, this is a very good question. It has been put to me and to us by Leon Wieseltier, who's one of the principal organizers of the general meeting. So I'm glad for this question. He does speak about American identity. Some of what he says about it is confined to a kind of ethnic generalization about really the English, what happens to the English when they emigrate across the Atlantic Ocean and become Americans. He seems to prefer the Americans to the English, but it's a kind of ethnic generalization. But he also makes a larger theoretical point, which is that the American, and I should have said this, the American institutions that I've described, the self-government that is permitted by decentralization, the businesses that arise, and perhaps above all, the new sense of religion that arises, and the new way of conceiving God more grandly than before. All of this, in his mind, creates a identifiable culture or personality, which is that of the American. And so he does see a national identity in it. In some other writings of his, he compares national identities in a very amusing way, because he, in one of his early essays about his trip to America, he describes traveling through the American Northwest in a region bordering on Canada. Now, you'll remember that Canada was originally settled by the French. Later it was conquered by the English. But the population of Canada in this period, the 1830s, is largely French. And he notices that the French Canadians, had not created a democratic society. So you don't get a democratic society just by moving across the ocean. They have not done it. They're living according to the old traditions. And he notices that what has resulted from this, which is that the French are afraid of moving away from one another. They live much more closely condensed, so land value is much higher. They pay a lot more for land because they're living all together. And they're, from a business point of view, inert. They're not adventurous. They're not rash and brave in their business efforts. The Americans, the Anglo-Americans, the English-speaking Americans, are venturing into the wilderness to make new farms, and the French Canadians are not. And so he sees a definite. This is I think the largest, or one of several national comparisons that he makes to show that yes, you can end up with national traits, and the American trait that he sees is dynamic, but it is a trait, and the French-Canadian trait that he sees is inert, and it is a trait, and these traits follow from or are in accord with the institutions that the several peoples have constructed.
I guess what I'm asking you is that he has these types of traits, he has these national characteristics and types of traits, but he doesn't have nationalism yet, right? In other words, there isn't American nationalism in the sense that, or any nationalism, because he was writing before it, I guess.
He's not writing before it, but so the question is there an American nationalism? So I'm asking, what is nationalism? He notices that there is certainly an American pride, which he laughs at, because he notices that if you criticize America to an American, you'll have hell to pay, and so he laughs at that very easily, and he shrugs it off, so there's an American pride, but there isn't really a sense of America as a national group in conflict with, let us say, the Europeans. No. And the America that he's describing is open to people from, if you leave aside the situation of black slavery, which is one exceptional situation, and then there's the question of the American Indians, which is another exceptional situation. But if you're speaking about people with the kind of education and cultural background that people have in Europe, that the United States that Tocqueville is describing is open to them all, and is welcoming and friendly to them all. So he discovers, for instance, that America as a whole is Protestant, but there's a place for the Catholics who are sometimes French and sometimes Irish, largely Irish, and he commends the role being played within the United States by the Irish and French Catholics. Similarly, he sees that in America there is a tendency to be able to sympathize with other peoples around the world who may be oppressed. So he finds himself attending, in 1831, a solidarity meeting somewhere out west, in the American West, by Americans for the oppressed of Poland, because the Poles have lost the uprising of the November uprising of 1830. So he sees this kind of openness. But of course, there is black slavery, which is grotesque, and then there's the tragic condition of the American Indians. So America has its dreadful flaws, but in principle, the democratic quality is not a nationalist one. It's not a destiny of some ethnic group or national group, the Americans. It's open to everybody. The question is well put. This is a period when the American Indians still dominate a large part of the continent, and the European, what he calls the European population, the Anglo-Americans, begin on the east coast, the Atlantic coast, and are moving progressively westward. And as they do, they come into conflict with the Indians. And he writes about this really brilliantly and movingly. He weeps for the Indians, and he describes seeing the Indians, a group of Indians crossing the Mississippi as they're fleeing the whites. And his description of this is just heartbreaking, because the Indians are crossing the river on rafts, and they've left their dogs behind. And when the dogs realize they've been abandoned, the dogs start to bark. So the Indians are crossing the river, the dogs are barking, abandoned, and it's just to weep. And so he understands the full tragedy of it. But he also understands the extreme difficulty of coping with it. He does, because he explains, first of all, why the Indians are fleeing. The Indians are fleeing not necessarily because they've been persecuted. The Indians flee because as the European farmers advance westward, when they create a farm, if they carve out a piece of the wilderness and build a farm, it means that the animals, the wild animals, flee because they can't survive on a farm. They need that full wilderness. So the animals are fleeing ahead of the pioneer farmers. And as the animals flee, the Indians, who are hunters, must follow the animals. And so the only solution for the Indians is to give up hunting and become farmers. Then he explains that white society, in general, would accept the Indians as farmers. The Indians are invited to join white society and be farmers. But they have no educational background in farming. They don't know how to farm. They're hunters. They have no skills at farming, so that they can become farmers. But if they become farmers, they immediately become the lowest, poorest, most miserable farmers. So they are invited to join white society, but in the nature of things, they're invited to join it only at the very bottom. So they were offered, in short, humiliation. So they're given a choice between flight and the continuation of their own manner of living, or humiliation. And they choose flight. And yet, so that is his account of that. He doesn't so much discuss the Indian wars in which massacres take place. And after all, it's not so much what destroys the Indians is not so much military action as this economic development, which leaves no place for the Indians. And he's very touching. As long as you've asked this question, let me speak for a moment about the blacks, because he has a fantastic chapter called The Three Races in America, meaning the whites, the Indians, and the blacks. And he explains that the Indians are welcome to join white society, but prefer not to. The blacks are demanding to join white society and are forbidden to. So it's a complete, it's a complete contradiction. And his sympathy for the blacks is again total, though he understands that the whole structure of society is also devastating to them too, because the structure of society in their case is designed to give them a bad opinion of themselves. So the blacks must struggle against the opinion that everybody has of them, which is that they are inferior, which then they incorporate into themselves and must struggle again, must engage in this cultural struggle. Tocqueville, does not think that blacks are inferior. He has no doubt that everybody is equal. But he understands that the cultural message is being delivered to the blacks who want to get into society or refuse to think poorly of themselves and are just in a devastating situation. So he cannot imagine a solution to either of these problems of the Indians and their place in American life, or the blacks and their place in American life. And it's part of what leads him to the gloom that finally makes him think about Russians.
Okay, thank you.
I can't speak to the Ukrainian situation, but I can comment on what Tocqueville thinks. And Tocqueville does admire the American Constitution, but he's very clear that a piece of paper by itself does not suffice. So he comments at one point that in Mexico, the Mexicans have adopted, have imitated the American Constitution, so have drawn up their own constitution. But it's just paper, because they have the letter of the Constitution, but they don't have the spirit of the Constitution. For him, the spirit is generalized among the population as a whole through the mechanisms I've just described. That is, the ordinary person learns the qualities of citizenship by participating in town meetings and voluntary associations and this kind of thing, by being an activist. And at the same time, Tocqueville has a great admiration for lawyers and lawyers as a class. He wonders a lot, is it really possible to have a society without an aristocracy? And he ventures the thought that in the American democracy that he sees, there is a sort of aristocracy which consists of lawyers. And the lawyers, that is, the lawyers have the role of presiding in a presumably disinterested way over a system of objective rules. So the cult of law, the respect of law, seems to him crucial. So it's a combination of the knowledge of citizenship that is drawn up by, that is conjured by participation in local governmental bodies and in voluntary associations, combined with a respect for law, combined with a class of lawyers who themselves respect law. And it's this whole system of people, not just the paper. I would think that Tocqueville would think that if you were going to rely just on getting a good document, you might well end up in what he describes as the Mexican situation, in which you had no progress at all in Mexico of 1830. They have a constitution that seems excellent, but they don't have the spirit of it. The crucial thing is to have the spirit of it diffused among the people. Really, they're the same question, which is what makes for a successful revolution instead of a failed one, according to Tocqueville. So I think he was transformed by his trip to the United States because, after all, no one in Europe had ever seen a successful democracy. It was an idea. It was a utopian project. There were many mad notions of how to go about it. The one substantial effort to build something like that was the French Revolution of 1789, which ended up a catastrophe. So all that anyone knew for a fact from having seen with their own eyes was that the project was undoable, and yet people wanted to do it. So Tocqueville was transformed by his recognition that in the United States it had been thus far, until 1831, a success, and an admirable society had arisen. What he certainly didn't love the idea of revolutions. One of the things that he admired about the United States was that, having constructed a democratic republic with liberty, it had henceforth been able to avoid revolutions. And one of the aspects of a democratic republic that recommended itself to him, and that he was recommending to his readers, and I think to his family, was that if you have such a society, democratic, with rule of law, you don't have revolutions anymore. Now, if you're the Tocqueville family, whose members of which have been guillotined and imprisoned and so forth, a society that doesn't have revolutions anymore sounds great. And if the way to get such a society is, however, to abandon one's own aristocratic privileges and just enroll as citizens like everyone else in a democratic society, maybe it's a good deal. Because you'll be merely citizens like everyone else, but then again, you won't be guillotined. So he did think that. What should be said to the Ukrainians you know, it's not for me to say, but Tocqueville says it. Really, you should, you know, the students here, intellectuals, should read his book, because his book is written as an advice guide to Europeans who are contemplating making the shift to a democratic society. And it bears precisely on questions of what to think of a constitution. Is a constitution good enough by itself? And what exactly should be done about political parties and this kind of thing? And I think what you get in Tocqueville is a broad horizon of things, and that his answer is that it is no one thing in particular. It's only a demagogue who will stand up and give a speech saying, I have the one thing that's going to solve the problems of society, which is, you know, the perfect constitution, or perhaps my own rule, or some single individual reform. And he explains here, no, it's the whole panoply of things, all to be infused with the democratic spirit, meaning the equality of status of everyone, and this crucial quality of participation that leads to a sense of social and civic responsibility. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much.